11 top lawyers failed. Yet in just 2 minutes, a quiet janitor uncovered the answer they'd all missed, leaving an entire boardroom stunned. What the millionaire CEO did next shocked everyone. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and once you've heard the full story, give it a score from 0 to 10. Let's begin. I was halfway through a crisis that could end my quarter and bend my reputation when I saw her kneeling by the conference room glass, wiping a streak that the night crew had missed, her bucket against the wall like an apology, and the legal team arguing around me as if volume were a strategy rather than a shield. The vendors' council had sent a notice of termination with penalties that would bleed 8 figures. Our acquisition of a logistics startup would fall apart if we missed the shipment thresholds, and my general counsel kept repeating that there was no way out because of a non-waiver, non-severability, liquidated damages clause that read like cement. I told them to step out for 10 minutes so I could breathe, and as the door closed, the woman with the rag stood up slowly, eyes on the printed notice I had left on the table, then on me, and she said in a careful voice that carried both nerves and certainty that I might be reading page for the way the vendor wanted me to and not the way the law required. I should have dismissed her. A man in my position learns to keep boundaries like guardrails. Yet I heard myself ask what she meant, and she walked to the table without touching anything and said she used to work nights at the county courthouse as a clerk's assistant and had read thousands of contracts while waiting for the copier to stop moaning. And this one hid an order of precedence paragraph in the definitions that made the glossy service exhibit subordinate to the body of the agreement. And if that was true, the force majeure language we had ignored because it looked generic would override the penalty schedule, and the shortage that triggered our default fell within a transportation embargo declared by the Port Authority 2 days earlier. I looked at her badge, which read Marina, and I asked her to show me the text, and she did not touch the paper. She only asked me to scroll on my screen and read aloud the sentence that changed everything. In case of conflict, the agreement prevails over any exhibit. I called the team back in, told them to sit, watched the same lawyers who had been so sure chew on every word as if it were new food, and within 20 minutes the room turned. The panic softened into precision. The reply drafted itself, and my GC, who hates being wrong more than rain at an outdoor wedding, cleared his throat and admitted she was right. I asked where she had learned to see structure in a fog, and she said she loved the way language forced big men to behave, then apologized for speaking out of turn because she understood lines mattered even when truth did too. I told her lines were useful until they kept the right person outside them, and as my assistant printed the revised letter for my signature, the vendors' council called with a tone that had lost its swagger, and we negotiated from dry ground rather than floodwater. When the call ended and the letter went out and the bleeding stopped, I thanked her with the same voice I used for investors I needed for the long haul, and she said she would be late to the next floor because she had to rinse her mop. Then she added that if I ever needed help reading what people pretended not to say, she would gladly point, not push. I told her I would walk her to the elevator because I needed the air, and as we stepped into the hall, my CFO texted that the startup had stayed in. The board chair texted a single relieved sentence, and I looked at Marina and realized I was not done with this conversation. I asked her to come back at 6 for a 10-minute debrief with my counsel, and she said 10 minutes would be enough if the counsel listened with both ears. And when the doors closed, I knew I had just watched a stranger open a door in me that had stuck for years, the door that said talent rises even when credentials do not. And if I did not follow that truth, I would go back to pretending that power meant certainty rather than attention, and I was not interested in pretending anymore, which is why at 6 I waited by the glass with 2 cups of tea and a stack of our ugliest agreements and a question I could not shake. Who exactly was this woman, and how far would she let me pull her into the light? Hook. By sunrise the vendor would fold, but before midnight my legal chief would ask me whether I understood what it meant to invite a cleaner into a war room, and I would answer yes, just as a fire alarm on Marina's past finally went off in mine. She arrived in a thrift store blazer that fit like a promise she was still making to herself, hair pulled back, hands steady, and when my counsel tried to seat her against the wall, the way we do with suppliers and staff who observe rather than shape, I asked her to sit at the table and told the room she had found the hinge we all missed. She did not smile. She only asked for the version history of the contract and the email thread that accompanied the last round of edits. Then traced with her finger the dates we had accepted the vendor's red lines without reconciling them to our standard order of precedence. And she said in that patient tone that turns chaos into steps that our mistake was not legal weakness but structural laziness. that people like us who move fast forget that order is part of value. Then she stopped and apologized for the sermon, and I said sermons were fine when they saved a company 8 figures. When the lawyers left, she told me her story in one long line that did not ask for pity. Raised by a grandmother who worked reception at a bus depot and brought home custody guides for drivers who were fighting for visitation. Nights in the courthouse copy room reading motions as if they were novels. A scholarship that ended when her mother relapsed and needed someone who could keep the electricity on. Then years of cleaning, caring, and refusing to forget the law she loved. I asked why she had never gone back, and she said time gathers like snow and you keep telling yourself you will dig the car out tomorrow until one day you realize you have been walking to work for 3 winters, and the idea of turning the engine feels like arrogance. Then she shrugged as if that confession were a luxury, and I felt something in me soften the way it only does when strength arrives without performance. Respect grows fast when it is watered with results, and the day after the crisis I asked her to review our template for vendor onboarding with my GC, who received the suggestion like medicine he did not request, and she found 3 more places where our language let others define our risk, and she explained them to the team the way a nurse explains procedure to a frightened patient, firm rather than loud. I sent her home with a retainer form and told her we would pay for every minute she gave us. That saved us hours, and she refused because she said lines still mattered, and she was not yet on our payroll, and I realized stubborn honor is the most expensive quality in any building and also the most valuable, so I told HR to fix the line fast. On the 3rd day my board chair called with questions about rumors that I had a janitor whisperer. And I said the rumor was both lazy and accurate, and if the board's fear of headlines was stronger than its love of competence, then we had a different problem. And he laughed in that polished way people in my circle learn in business schools, then said he would keep an open mind if I kept the results public and the theater private. I thanked him, hung up, and asked Marina if public attention would harm her, and she said attention had never paid a bill in her life but truth had, and if I could promise her the truth of the work she would accept whatever followed. That evening she stayed late to help us clean up our indemnity language across 6 agreements, and as the floor crew came in for the actual cleaning she put her blazer in her tote, tied her apron, and returned to her cart, and I stood in the window watching my reflection argue with itself. One part accustomed to the story of the cold man who hires only credentials, the other part meeting a new voice I trusted more, the voice that said I knew value when I saw it, even if it wore rubber gloves. I asked her if she would consider a temporary role on my legal ops team while we figured out training and tuition, and she said she would consider anything that did not require her to pretend to be someone she was not, which is why I promised the only thing I could work that mattered and the chance to turn time back into a door rather than a wall. Hook. The first test of that promise came sooner than I wished, because the whistle that would carry her name beyond our walls was about to blow from a place no lawyer controls. An elevator camera and a phone set to record. It began with the kind of small cruelty that rots cultures from the inside and waits for the right light to show itself. A procurement VP joking outside the elevators that we had promoted a mop. Laughter that sounded expensive, and Marina standing 10 paces away with a folder of redlined clauses that would save those same men a lawsuit. I was 2 steps behind, heard the sentence, saw the flinch, and before I could speak, she said in a voice I had not yet heard that he was welcome to read the clause she had corrected to keep his team out of jail, that she would hold the door for him not because he was above her but because she was raised to respect the building even when the building did not respect her. And as the elevator opened, someone's phone caught her words and the VP's face and the silence of the others. By evening that clip sat on a platform that feeds on conflict and returns it hotter than it arrived, and strangers wrote versions of our story that I did not control, and my PR chief asked whether I wanted to point the story toward merit or redemption, and I said neither. I wanted to point it toward the work, which is simpler and harder. We issued a statement with no adjectives and only one claim, that the person who corrected our contract saved us money and deserved our thanks. Then I told the VP he would apologize in a room without cameras and then again in one with them because humiliation was not my aim but repair was, and he asked if we were going to fire him to feed the crowd, and I said we would not fire him for a sentence but we would measure him by what he did with the lesson. The calls came in from other CEOs pretending to advise me while scanning for weakness, and one asked if I was building a myth of the cleaner who knows the law. And I said there was no myth, only a woman who paid attention, and if the story embarrassed him perhaps his embarrassment was a signal rather than a wound. Marina stayed late that night answering staff emails from people who had seen the clip and wanted to say they were tired of pretending that respect had a dress code. And when I told her she didn't owe anyone a reply, she said sometimes the first door people open is a message box because it feels less dangerous than speaking in a hallway. 2 days later, an employment blog profiled her without her permission, using a high school photo that made her look like a ghost you could push around, and she came to my office to ask for help drawing a circle she could live inside. Not a wall that shut her out, but a line that said yes to work and no to spectacle. I hired a communications coach to shield her time, arranged tuition advice with a former dean who owed me more than one favor, and asked her, clumsy as a man who has too many strategies and too few questions, what she wanted beyond the next contract. And she said she wanted to sleep at night without feeling like the law was a city she could see but not enter, which meant she wanted to step inside on her own feet and stay. Respect grows friendship when it gets a chance, and while neither of us used that word, the work began to sound less like instructions and more like conversation. She told me about the grandmother who taught her to write letters that made judges pause. I told her about my father who demanded performance like oxygen and gave praise like medicine you had to earn, and we did not pretend the distance between our lives could be bridged by a few late nights with red pens. But we also did not pretend. The bridge was impossible, and that honesty steadied us when the next challenge arrived. Because crises do not queue, they collide, and the union representing drivers at our largest distribution partner filed a grievance that could block 40% of our deliveries if we could not show compliance with a safety clause our operations team believed was aspirational rather than binding, and my GC said we would need to buy time with money, and Marina asked for the collective bargaining agreement and the email logs with timestamps around the last accident report, then said quietly that aspiration becomes obligation when management writes "we will" in an email meant to quiet fear. And if we did not shape a corrective plan with the union by Monday, we would be arguing against our own words on Wednesday. We met the union the next morning at 7, bleary and defensive, and she spoke first with a clarity I have heard in courtrooms from lawyers twice her age and 5 times her salary, saying that we had failed to align policy with practice, that we could pretend we meant hope where we wrote promise, or we could accept that plain language matters because it keeps people alive. And then she laid out the plan she had drafted in a night: audited routes, shared reporting dashboards, independent safety monitors funded by us but chosen by them, and a schedule that made speed a metric but not a god. By noon we had a path, and by afternoon the rumor had started that the cleaner had negotiated a truce that the executives could not, and my phone filled with both praise and warnings about the monster I was creating, as if competence with a mop and a statute created a beast rather than a standard. Hook. The story did not stop there, because a camera loves a voice that refuses to tremble, and the night Marina accepted an invitation to speak at a community legal clinic about plain language and power, someone streamed it, someone clipped it, and by morning she was viral for the second time, but this time with me standing behind her, and the question became whether I was backing her out of conviction or calculation, and I had to answer it first to myself. When the clinic posted the clip of Marina explaining how the word "will" had closed a worker's casket and how the word "may" could keep the next one open, the numbers went from dozens to hundreds to thousands as if a hidden switch had flipped, and my comms chief told me to brace for the storm you cannot buy your way out of, the one that tests whether your culture is posture or practice. I asked Marina if she wanted us to take the clip down, and she said taking truth down never kept anyone safe, that she understood the risks and would stand where the work needed her, but she would not accept interviews about her journey, because the only story that mattered was the policy we were changing tomorrow morning at 8. By 8 the next day we had a cross-company meeting where I did something I am not proud of saying felt new. I seated the microphone after 2 sentences, and she walked the floor managers through our revised language and the reason behind each change, not as a scolding but as a map, and I watched men who had spent years being rewarded for speed slow down long enough to ask questions that deserved answers. After the meeting, the HR lead pulled me aside and said staff sign-ups for our tuition program had spiked, that the cleaning crew had asked whether the corporate library could be open in the evenings, and I said yes before she finished the sentence. The attention had a price, and it came dressed as respect from strangers and resentment from a few colleagues who had waited a decade to present in all hands only to watch a woman without a degree stand where they wanted to stand. I heard the whispers, I read the emails, and I sat with my own discomfort at having changed the room's temperature without getting everyone a coat. Then I gathered the VPs who thought their oxygen was shrinking and told them I would measure them by the number of doors they opened rather than the hours they guarded, and if that sounded like an ultimatum it was, because growth without generosity turns into a pyramid, and I am not interested in monuments. That week the first small invitations arrived for her to speak on panels I would have sent my general counsel to, and while we declined most, we accepted one with a local law school because the dean promised students who were first generation and tired of hearing success described as a straight line. She wore the thrift blazer, carried the same tote, and told a room that smelled like dust and ambition that she had not failed to become a lawyer. She had delayed it, and delay is not death if you keep the language alive. And when a student asked how she stayed calm in rooms designed to make her small, she said she remembered that paper does not care what you wear, and silence can be a tool when the next sentence is built like a bridge. On Friday night, the attention found my home, a journalist I respected asking for a profile on the CEO who broke the wall, and I recognized the bait even when it arrived with compliments because profiles are soft weapons, they make heroes out of decisions that should be normal, and I told him we would talk when Marina had a contract that matched her contribution and a plan for school, not because optics mattered to me more than reality, but because I was learning the only way to make this more than a story was to turn it into structure. He said I was avoiding the spotlight, and I told him I was moving it. In the quiet after the calls, I found myself thinking about her past more than my future. The missing years that don't fit neatly on a resume, the way she looked at conference tables like she had built them and cleaned them and argued on them, and I asked her gently whether anyone had ever offered to sponsor her degree rather than praise her grit. She laughed without bitterness and said people love grit because it costs them nothing, and I told her that if she wanted law school, I would fund what loans refused, and if she wanted to build an internal legal operations team that hired talent others overlooked, I would stand aside and let her choose, and she looked at me with a caution that felt like dignity and said she would choose the team now and the classroom next, because she wanted to show the building what was possible before she left it for lectures. We set a 30-day plan. Revise every vendor template, install a living playbook in plain language, train managers to stop outsourcing morality to sign pages, and launch a pilot for employees who had started degrees they could not finish. Somewhere inside that list, the personal and the professional braided themselves into something I did not bother untangling. Long conversations at 11 about why power likes fog, shared coffee at 6 while the city stretched awake, and a warmth that was not romance but also not romance, and I told myself I would not name it until she had her seat and her shield. The month had begun with a contract clause and a mop, and it ended with a schedule that placed her at the center of work she had once watched from the corners. That Friday, as we locked the office, my phone buzzed with a message from our largest customer asking whether the rumors about a decisive woman in a blue blazer were true, because they were bringing us a problem that would test whatever she had built, and they wanted to know if the person who had seen through paper could also see through people. Hook. Monday morning at 9, $50 million and a courtroom date would land on our table with a note that read urgent. And every eye would turn to Marina, and one new kind of fear would turn to me. What happens when your quiet hero has to stand in the loudest room? Our customer's crisis arrived in 3 binders and 1 bruise, a supplier accused of cutting corners on safety equipment that failed in the field, photographs that belonged in reports rather than press, a trial date that had been moved up by a judge tired of continuances, and a settlement offer that smelled like panic. My counsel proposed the usual posture. Deny knowledge, blame a rogue manager, pay to hush, while Marina read the indemnity net like a navigator, then closed the binder and said we had 2 choices: confess failure and fix the system in public, or shove the mess into a closet and wait for the smell to reach the stairwell. I asked her which kept people alive, and she said the first, and when my CFO asked which protected quarterly guidance, she said that was the wrong sentence for the wrong hour. The courtroom does not care about our calendar, so we took the room we had and turned it into a rehearsal, not for performance but for clarity. She made the VP who signed the supplier contract read aloud the clause he had skimmed, made the plant manager explain the pressure he felt to hit numbers we bragged about to analysts, made me say why I allowed a culture that treated safety reports like traffic cones you drive around when you're late, and when I stumbled, she did not comfort me, she said. The jury would not either. Then she drafted the spine of a statement our customer could use if we had the courage to stand next to it, and it began with the sentence no man at my level likes to say, "We were wrong." The customer's CEO, a woman who has kept her company alive by being smarter than men who underestimate her, watched the rehearsal and decided to risk sunlight, and she asked Marina to sit with her counsel to help thread the needle between apology and liability without starving the truth, and my GC pulled me aside to ask whether I understood that I was letting a cleaner shape the posture of 2 companies before a judge who did not care about origin stories. I told him I understood that I was letting the best reader in the room choose the clearest line, and if he wanted to keep his job, he could learn from the example rather than build a file. On the morning of the hearing, we sent a letter to the court and to the workers who had been handed faulty gear, committing to an independent audit, a shared fund for injuries, and a procurement overhaul that put worker safety ahead of efficiency metrics, and the judge, who has lived long enough to smell sincerity and spin, thanked the parties for moving this toward restitution rather than theater. The press called it a staged mea culpa, social media divided into camps. But the men who wore the gloves we had promised to buy safer versions of sent a note that said they had never heard executives admit the obvious while cashing the cost, and that message weighed more than the headlines. After the hearing, we returned to an office that felt different, as if a window had opened and the air had better oxygen in it. The board chair called to say he had not agreed with our risk but respected our outcome, and I told him respect felt thin when it arrived only after results, and he changed the subject to growth, as if the company were a patient with a fever whose chart needed a new line. I ended the call and found Marina in the quiet room we had built for staff who needed 15 minutes without screens, and she was not resting. She was reading a bar prep guide as if the month had found an extra hour, and when I asked whether she was tired she said yes, then added that being tired and being alive were not opposites. That night, because the world will always try to pull you back into old habits, an investor dinner tempted me with a distraction, men congratulating me for using the cleaner to humanize the brand, a phrase that made my skin cold. I left early with an honesty that offended the host, returned to the office, found Marina holding a printout of the tuition plan HR had rushed, and I told her we would put her name on the program if she wanted it there, and she said names matter less than doors, and I countered that a name can become a door for others, and we settled on a plan that made the door larger than the name. By the end of the week our inboxes had changed shape. Resumes from paralegals who had left law after children or illness and wanted back in, maintenance staff who had taken pre-law classes at night and given up at dawn, managers who wanted plain language training so they could stop hiding behind jargon that cost lives. I funded a pilot legal ops cohort with time on the clock and mentors who would not condescend, and I gave Marina the right to hire and fire within that cohort because she had earned the authority the old way by doing the work in the dark. We thought we had a month to scale quietly, but attention does not honor our calendars. A regional morning show asked for a segment on the cleaner who changed a clause and a company. And while we intended to say no, her grandmother saw the invitation on television, called the number in a voice landlines were built for, and told the producer that her granddaughter did not need a camera to do her job but would stand there if it kept a door open for one more person like her. And when Marina told me the story, she laughed for the first time in weeks, the kind of laugh that turns fatigue into fuel. We chose a date, we set conditions, we prepared our truths, and the night before the segment I stood at the window again, watching the city mistake itself for permanence, and I understood I was no longer the man who believed control was the same as leadership. Leadership, I was learning, is who you invite to speak and whose risk you choose to shoulder when the lights get hot. Marina would sit on a couch tomorrow and tell a room full of strangers why the word will matters, and I would sit behind the camera and mean it when I said she did not work for me. I worked for what she made possible. Hook. The segment lit up, the phones rang, the inboxes filled, and then the barrier I had been ignoring broke. The line between mentor and man, because the night the city slept and the studio lights dimmed, I found myself at my office door rehearsing a sentence that would either honor the work or destroy it. How do you ask the person who saved your company whether there is room in her life for you beyond the table? I waited until the building had emptied and the custodial shift rolled its carts past the elevators like tides. Waited until the HR notifications had slowed and the calendar had stopped shouting. Then knocked on the glass of the small room where Marina was sketching a training module in the margin of a bar outline. I told her there was a sentence I did not know how to say without 3 disclaimers, and she laughed and said disclaimers are just fear that learned grammar. And I said fine, then I said it. I was beginning to care for her in a way that exceeded the gratitude and respect I owed her, and I did not want to pretend that didn't exist, but I would not risk her work or her safety for the sake of my feelings. And if this was an indulgence I should keep to myself, I would seal it and keep walking. She did not speak immediately, and the silence felt less like rejection and more like someone choosing the right sizes for delicate words. She said she had suspected we were standing at the edge of a different room and had chosen not to point because she did not want the ceiling to lower on the work. And then she said she had learned, too early and too deeply, that men with power often confuse protection with possession, and she would not live that script again. Finally, she said she felt what I felt but would only step forward if we wrote rules together that preserved the container we had built. Full transparency with HR, no direct reporting line, no special passes, and a promise that the first time the work suffered we would step back without drama. I agreed before she finished, not out of hunger but out of relief that the way forward was structure rather than impulse. We wrote the rules down like adults who understand that romance without architecture collapses under its own sweetness. We informed HR with a note that made the lawyer blink. We shifted her role to report into my operations chief, and we kept our hands to ourselves at work not because the law required it but because we wanted the rooms we had changed to stay changed. The next morning felt like any other except that now I could name the warmth that had been traveling the halls for weeks. Public attention does not care about our rules, and 2 days later a blog ran a line that suggested I had elevated a mistress. A word dragged from centuries of contempt, and while my first instinct was to let silence kill it, Marina said silence had almost killed her mother, and we answered with a sentence written in plain language. 2 colleagues with clear boundaries and published policies were building a program to return talent to a profession that had priced it out. The story stalled, the work continued, and my respect for her clarity grew in the way respect does when it survives a storm. On the last Friday of the month, our big case returned with a subpoena that required me to testify about procurement practices I had inherited and tolerated. And while my legal team prepared me with phrases that would survive cross-examination, Marina prepared me with truths that would survive my own conscience, reminding me that the point of speaking under oath was not to protect my name but to protect the people who counted on us to stop shipping harm. In the hallway outside the deposition room, she took my hand for the length of a single breath. Not a theater gesture but a transfer of steadiness. And I walked in with a back that did not bow. I told the truth, the court reporter typed it into a record that would outlive any press cycle, and when I emerged I felt lighter in the way you do when you stop managing your reflection and start managing your duty. The opposing counsel tried to rattle me with the rumor blog, and I answered on the record that women do not lose their right to change a company because a man happens to love them, and if the court had questions about our governance it could read the policy we filed. And the judge asked counsel to return to matters at hand. That weekend we rested in the simplest way people with too much attention can, in a grocery store where no one knows your name, in a park where a bench is just a bench, and in my kitchen where she argued for salt as if it were a principle and I surrendered because I wanted the food to taste like her insistence. On Sunday night we sat with the scholarship applications for the pilot cohort and chose 4 names that felt like anchors rather than favors, and she cried once and said she wished someone had let her be an applicant rather than an exception, and I said we were building a room where neither word would carry that weight again. The month that had threatened to collapse under the weight of a viral clip had held, and as we prepared for the decisive event the court had set, a hearing where our new procurement policy would be tested against the old damage, we knew the next week would either turn this month into a hinge the company never forgot or reduce it to a story we would tell ourselves to feel better. I had watched the woman I once called a cleaner become my compass and my equal, and if we were going to win, we would win with the same tool that started everything: plain language spoken without fear. Hook. The courthouse doors opened on a Tuesday heavy with cameras. The union sat behind us, the injured workers sat beside them, and the judge asked whether our promises were paper or practice, and we had to show him in real time that a company can change in 30 days without lying about yesterday. We entered with binders that smelled like work, not press, affidavits from supervisors who had been trained on the new plain language policy, logs from the independent safety monitors that showed near misses caught and corrected, a calendar of joint reviews with the union signed by my operations chief and their steward, and a fund ledger with checks already cashed by families who should never have needed them. The judge, who wore impatience like a robe, asked why he should believe a month could undo a culture that took years to calcify, and Marina answered before I could breathe, saying belief was beside the point, that what mattered was verification, and then she laid the timeline on the table like a bridge you could test with your weight. Opposing counsel tried to paint our actions as theater designed to soften a verdict, and Marina said theater does not install guardrails or accept third-party audits with teeth. Theater does not let an independent panel publish findings that might embarrass the C-suite, and theater certainly does not authorize a union-selected monitor to shut down a line when risk spikes. The judge asked whether she was counsel of record, and she said no. She was the company's legal operations lead and a student of promises, and he grunted in a way that, from a judge, amounts to respect. The injured workers' representative, a man who had every right to hate our logo, stood and said the last 4 weeks had felt less like spin and more like contrition that understood its job, and while he was not prepared to forgive, he was prepared to continue working under the new structure because it made his people less likely to bury a brother. That sentence moved more weight in the room than any of our binders, and the judge set a compliance schedule that turned our commitments into orders, then turned to me and asked whether I had anything to add, and I said only that I was grateful for the chance to replace posture with practice. When we exited into the hard light and the cameras lifted their eyelids, the PR team prepared me to speak, but I gave the microphones to the union steward and to Marina, because the public would trust the man with the calloused hands and the woman with the plain words more than the millionaire who had finally remembered that money cannot buy back trust. It can only fund the work that slowly earns it. They spoke the way they had in court, without adjectives, and the feed carried those sentences farther than any slogan could. Back in the office, the reaction split the way reaction always does. Half the messages thanked us for doing what we should have done before they needed to ask, the other half accused us of sanctimony, and I found myself calmer than I expected because I was no longer measuring my day by noise. What mattered was that a man would go home tomorrow with all his fingers because a monitor had shut down a machine, and that a woman would keep her job because her manager could finally understand a policy and apply it. Late that night, when the building had returned to hum and the month's paper had finally settled into files, Marina pulled a small envelope from her tote and handed it to me with both hands, the way people hand over documents that cost them something to get. Inside was a letter of admission to a part-time evening program at the state law school, starting in 8 weeks, conditional on completing 2 prerequisite courses she had already begun online at 3 in the morning, and she said she had not wanted to show me until the hearing was over because she did not want to confuse our wins with her news. I did not pretend the letter did not shake me because joy does that to a body that has played defense for too long. I asked whether she wanted me to call the dean in Greece what did not need Greece, and she said no with a smile, saying the only thing I could do for her now was keep the cohort funded and the policy enforced so she was not studying at night only to watch daylight ruin what we had built. I told her I would, and meant it with the same muscle I used to close 9-figure deals. We fell asleep at my place with the sound of a city that never apologizes but sometimes listens, and in the morning we woke to an email from the journalist who had wanted a profile, now asking if he could write about the program rather than the people, and we said yes because the door was more important than our faces. The story ran with photos of 4 cohort members at a whiteboard, not a single glamour shot, and donations arrived for the fund from places that could not pronounce our company name, and the part of me that used to snack on recognition felt full for once in a way that did not make me sick. The month still had 3 days left, and crises respect neither calendars nor fatigue. Our biggest potential client, a public agency that chooses vendors the way a cautious heart chooses a second love, sent a draft agreement with a clause that would force us to surrender our independent monitor during any surge period, which translated to, when risk spikes, we want you to go faster with fewer breaks. And the old me would have justified signing by telling myself we would police our own lines. But the man who had sat in court with Marina was no longer interested in elegant hypocrisy, which is why I told my team we would walk away unless the clause changed. They called our bluff because that is what people do when they think your month of clarity has an expiration date, and I brought Marina into the negotiation not as a secret weapon but as our standard, and she told them calmly that we had learned the hard way that speed without brakes is just a countdown to grief. And if that meant we did not win their badge, we could live with that, and the silence that followed felt like the sound of a room testing its conscience. By end of day we had a revised clause that kept the monitor in place when it mattered most. Hook. The next morning, with 2 days left in the month, the agency asked for a public signing and a joint town hall, and on that stage in front of 1,000 workers, a reporter would ask if Marina was an employee or my partner, and we would need to answer without losing either the truth or the structure we had sworn to keep. The town hall filled with people whose hands make cities work, sanitation crews in high-visibility vests, bus mechanics with grease under their nails, procurement officers with clipboards they had learned to treat like shields, and I felt the old instinct to control the room rise and pass, replaced by the steadier urge to host rather than dominate. We spoke about the clause we refused, about the monitor we kept, about the plain language policy that would sit on every wall in break rooms where posters used to whisper compliance nobody read, and then the inevitable question arrived from a reporter who had done her homework and had earned her right to ask. What exactly was Marina to this company and to me? We had discussed this moment not as an if but a when, and yet the air still tightened because the gap between principle and practice is made of pulses. I said she was the architect of the policy that kept workers safe and the lead of the legal operations team that had made our commitments visible and verifiable, and I said she was also the person I loved, and that the company had written and published boundaries that kept our work clean, and I paused long enough to let the room test whether I was asking for indulgence or offering clarity. Marina took the microphone after me and said that love does not entitle anyone to more power at work, that she had already turned down assignments that confused lines, and that any employee who saw favoritism could use the anonymous portal we had built and watch us correct it in daylight. There were murmurs, the sound of a room updating its picture of a man it had filed under predictable, and then there was applause from a corner where the union steward stood, the kind of applause that says not congratulations, but we see you working the way you said you would. The agency head, a woman who had seen less honest arrangements dressed in better lies, thanked us for answering without theater, and we returned to talking about gloves and boots and transport routes, which felt like a relief because the work is the only part that holds when lights cool. After the event, a handful of our people pulled Marina aside and told her they had never heard someone speak about boundaries without condescension, that they had loved and worked and been fired for less in other buildings, and that hearing the rules said out loud made them feel safer to do their jobs without whispering. She listened the way she reads, fully, and promised to add an explicit section to the policy about relationships and roles so no one had to guess where the lines were. That evening, as we packed for a quick overnight to meet the law school dean who wanted to formalize the cohort pipeline, my board chair called with a voice I had learned to translate, and the translation was concern disguised as collegiality. He suggested a sabbatical for Marina to let the heat cool, and I told him heat is not the problem, hypocrisy is, and we were not going to treat a woman's competence as a fire hazard because she had told the truth about us. And if the board needed to formalize its comfort, we could bring in an independent ethics officer to review our structure every quarter and publish the findings. He sighed the sigh of a man who has outlived his appetite for disruption and said, "Do what you must," and I said we would. The dean's office smelled like leather and long conversations, and he thanked Marina for forcing him to look at admissions with fresher eyes, then asked me how many seats I would underwrite beyond hers, and I said 12 over 3 years with a preference for students who had stopped and were starting again, and the look Marina gave me across that rug felt like a private ceremony no camera could improve. We left with a memorandum of understanding and a calendar, and with the kind of fatigue that tells you you're moving things that matter. On the drive back, she told me she had bought her grandmother a new stove with her signing bonus because the old one needed a shim and patience to light, and I told her I had called my father and, for the first time in years, told him without defensiveness that I was proud of something that had nothing to do with profit, and he surprised me by saying he was proud too, then surprised me more by asking if he could meet the woman who kept knocking grammar into men with titles. I laughed in the way you do when old stories tilt, and said we would consider it after the hearing was truly behind us. We slept like people in a house that had finally settled, and in the morning I opened an email from the judge's clerk confirming that the compliance report we had filed had satisfied the first milestone, and that the court would monitor us quarterly rather than monthly, a vote of cautious confidence that gave us room to work without breathing into a paper bag. I forwarded it to the team with thanks that named names, because credit given specifically has a way of building muscle where platitudes build fog. We had 1 day left in the month, one last milestone that was not legal but human. A graduation for the first 4 cohort members from our pilot program, held in the cafeteria because they wanted their colleagues and kids there instead of donors and strangers. Marina stood to speak and told them the truth she had earned. No one is coming to hand you a door with your name on it, but some of us are building hinges you can use if you bring your own hand. And I stood in the back and decided I would never again let a month end without a ceremony for the work that is easy to overlook inside the roar of quarterly calls. Hook. The next morning, the largest contract of my career would sit on my desk with a final clause circled in red, and the only way to win it without betraying what we had built would be to invite Marina to co-sign. Not as my employee, but as my partner in fact, and my board would either bless a new structure or force me to choose between what I loved and what I led. The contract from the public agency represented not only revenue but the chance to set a standard in an industry that had treated safety as an afterthought and plain language as a luxury. And the clause circled in red was not about monitors or timelines but about governance. They wanted assurance that the person who had authored our changes would remain in authority over their enforcement for the duration of the deal, which meant they were asking for Marina by name and title and continuity. The board called an emergency session to discuss whether committing a policy to a person was wise, and I said we were not binding ourselves to a personality but to a role with a charter, and that role existed because a person had built it. The discussion was what you would expect from people who think risk is a god they must placate, hands ringing about precedent and power, polite questions about succession plans, a few less polite questions about optics, and then the simplest question from the independent director we almost didn't hire because he was too blunt. Does this make the work safer, faster, clearer? I said yes without embroidery, and Marina, invited in as the architect, said the same, adding that if she left for law school full-time the charter would outlive her and the program would not collapse like a tent whose pole had snapped. The independent director nodded and said then the answer is yes. The vote passed with 2 abstentions that will sit in the minutes like footnotes to a story their authors will pretend they didn't write, and we sent a clean copy to the agency with a signature line that named the role rather than the person, but allowed a co-signature for the inaugural term. When the document returned, the pen felt heavier than any I had held at a closing, because the signature was not a flourish but a vow, and I asked Marina to stand beside me when I signed, then handed her the pen to place her name under mine, not because she belonged under anything, but because the structure demanded the order and we had agreed the structure would be our honesty. The ceremony that followed was simple because we asked for it to be no ribbon, no smoke, only a town hall and a Q&A where bus drivers asked how they could report contractor failures without retaliation, and procurement officers asked how they could translate the plain language to their other vendors. Marina answered with a patience that convinces without pressing, and I watched as the idea we had fought for became contagious in a way that marketing budgets only dream of. In the afternoon, when the cameras had left and the chairs were stacked, the board chair came to my office and closed the door, a gesture that usually signals ice, but his face had lost some of its old tension. He said he had watched me change this month and had been slower to change himself, that he had learned to love the feel of control too much, and that while he would not become a different man overnight, he could see that the company was better with this door open than shut, and he handed me a small envelope with a handwritten note from Marina congratulating her not on viral fame but on the least glamorous win of all sustained policy. That night, because endings deserve beginnings, I took Marina to the diner where I signed my first loan at 23, sat in the cracked booth that taught me humility when the lender almost did not show, and told her the real reason I had built this company so hard for so long, because the fear of being ordinary had chased me like weather, and I had let it decide my calendar. She listened and then said a line I will carry as long as I carry my name. Ordinary is not an insult when the ordinary thing you do keeps people alive. We paid in cash and left a tip that said thank you to a server who had been refilling other people's cups for 20 years. We went home to a clean inbox and a quiet night and an alarm set not for a flight but for a graduation ceremony for the children of our warehouse staff that we had moved to our lobby because our lobby has better light than the school gym. The kids wore paper caps that did not know the words supply chain or policy. They only knew that adults were clapping for them, and when the last cap fell and the last cupcake vanished, Marina leaned into my shoulder and said she could breathe inside this version of a company, and I said I could too. The month had given me outcomes that would please any investor. Retained deals, won contracts, stabilized risk. But the metric I will remember is the one I do not report. The number of times a worker's face changed when an executive used a sentence they could understand. I thought I would mark my life by the size of the numbers on my closing table, but this month taught me that numbers become furniture and sentences become walls, and I care more about what people lean on than what they look at. We fell asleep early because morning would bring a ceremony I had not planned to attend as anything other than a donor, but life likes to fold events into each other, and the dean had sent a last-minute note asking me to speak at the evening program's welcome, which meant I would stand at a lectern and thank a room full of night students for the courage to keep going, and then I would watch Marina walk across a stage she had cleared for herself with a mop and a claws and 1,000 patient corrections. Hook! I thought the ceremony would end with a handshake and a photograph, but the dean decided to add a surprise, and in front of a room of students who knew what delay feels like, he offered Marina something she had not dared to ask for, and I had the honor and the responsibility to answer first. The dean's remarks were brief until they weren't. He spoke about access and rigor and the myth that only the uninterrupted deserve to wear the title, and then he turned to Marina and said the faculty had voted to grant her advanced standing for experiential learning documented through our program, reducing her time to degree by a year if she accepted a heavier load, and he added that a donor had committed to cover what grants did not, and the room turned to look at me in the way rooms do when money is the tool and everyone can guess who is holding it. I stood and said what needed to be said plainly. That the door was hers, that the time was hers, that our company's commitment to the program did not depend on her remaining in the building, and that love that requires a person to shrink is not love I am interested in keeping. She accepted with a nod that looked like relief. a person finally allowed to choose without calculating who will pay, and afterward, in the lobby with paper cups and inexpensive cookies, she told me she would start the heavier load and stay in her role through the first year, then move to a formal externship while the team she had trained carried the policy forward. I said I would miss the days of sending her a clause at 11:47 p.m. and waking up to an answer, and she said the answer would still come, just with footnotes. We drove back through a city that had let us have our month and would now go back to pretending it doesn't notice when people grow. At a red light, she asked what I wanted in exchange for funding more seats and spending more nights in cafeterias clapping for kids whose parents would never meet my board, and I said I wanted nothing but the right to show up without being thanked, then corrected myself because honesty matters even in private. I wanted also the right to tell this story when men in my position pretended change was impossible, and I wanted the right to be measured by the lives that did not break because we slowed down. At home, sleep came slowly because endings are noisy even when they are happy, and I found myself on the balcony watching the city that trained me to love velocity, and I thought about my father and the silence between us that had started to heal when he asked to meet Marina. I called him, told him the month's last page, and he said a line I have been waiting to hear since I was 12. I was wrong about what matters, son, and I will not cheapen it by adding commentary. Morning brought the signing ceremony with the agency, our names in the right order under a clause that would outlive both our careers if we were careful, and then a quieter meeting with my leadership team where we turned the month into policy. A permanent legal operations program with a pathway into law school for those who wanted it, a relationship policy published and audited independently, a standing fund for safety that could not be swept into other budgets, and a commitment to publish our compliance data in plain language every quarter, even when it made us look human rather than perfect. At lunch, I walked Marina to the bus stop where she insisted on catching the line that dropped her 2 blocks from class, because arriving alone under a street lamp felt more like the life she had built than being dropped at the door by a driver who would not be there when finals came. We stood there like people at any corner, not headlines, and she told me she had called her grandmother to tell her the news, and the old woman had cried in a voice that sounded like a hymn and said to bring the syllabus over Sunday after church so she could frame it next to the custody guides she used to read on night shifts. Before she boarded, I asked the question I had kept for the end, not because I doubted the answer but because I wanted to hear it in daylight. Did she want to build a life with me that obeyed the same rules we had written for our work? Plain language, published boundaries, course corrections in daylight, and a promise that if either of us started to love the story more than the people, we would stop and fix it. She reached for my hand with fingers that had held rags and pages and microphones and said yes in a sentence so long and careful it felt like a contract we both wanted to sign. The bus pulled up, she squeezed my hand, and I watched her take a seat and pull out a notebook as if a month had not just placed her in 3 rooms at once. Boardroom, courtroom, classroom. And I felt something I had not felt since I closed my first deal that mattered to more than me. Peace that tasted like work done well and the right person beside me to keep me honest. When I returned to the office, the lobby smelled like coffee and paper caps, because the maintenance team had left up the decorations from the kids' graduation, and I told the receptionist to leave them through the weekend as a reminder that not all success needs marble. On my desk sat a simple frame with a printout of the clause that had begun our month, the order of precedence paragraph circled in red, a gift from my GC who had learned to love correction, and under it in Marina's hand, a line. I will keep by the door. In case of conflict, let the work prevail over the performance. That is how the month ends. Not with fireworks, but with a company that breathes better, a contract that keeps people alive when speed tempts them to forget, a woman who refused to let credentials define competence now holding a seat and a syllabus, and a man who used to think money could fix anything now measuring his days by the quality of the sentences that leave his mouth. I am still a millionaire and still a boss and still flawed in ways I will keep discovering, but I am also the person who chose the door over the pedestal, and if there is a moral here, it is not complicated. Honor the person who reads the fine print when your pride wants to skip it, then give her the pen, the policy, and, if she wants it, your name beside hers on the page you show the world.